You ask what Admiral Ko Tun Hwa was like personally. He had what in the Royal Navy would have been called the Nelson touch, which is to say that he could command respect and intimacy very easily by his approach, the way he greeted people. He was not a man for small talk, but he immediately put everyone at ease. I remember when I first met him, I was a young lad, under 30, and I was introduced to him by one of the great strategic philosophers of the world, Dr. Stephen Pisoni, who said, "This is my friend Tony Ko. He'll tell you everything you need to know about sea lanes and about Asia." And Admiral Ko went to me and said, "Hi, call me Tony." But he had a look in his eye which immediately invited relaxation, conversation, and so on. So he immediately was able to engage in serious talk. He got to the heart of things very easily and quickly, but he had a wonderful sense of humor and a twinkle in his eye, in a sense, which made you want to go back and forth with lots of ideas. He didn't make people defensive. He didn't make people refrain from coming up with ideas. He encouraged debate and conversation because he didn't, if you like, flaunt his knowledge. But it was clear from the first time I met him that he was a man who understood the breadth of issues, not just regarding maritime strategy and not just regarding Asia and China in particular, but he understood grand strategy, which was why he was such a good friend of so many of the leading thinkers in the strategic field, particularly Stephen Pisoni, who we both regarded as one of the great geniuses of strategic philosophy. Pisoni understood Admiral Ko. Admiral Ko understood Stephen Pisoni. They spoke the same language, which was grand strategy. And bear in mind, this is an age when very few people understood the whole meaning of grand strategy and how all of the pieces fit together. What Admiral Ko did was understand societies as a whole. He understood the social mechanisms which make societies do what they do, not just how militaries operate. And in that sense, he wasn't a classical admiral per se. He was, he had all the naval skills. He was a fighting admiral. He was a maritime strategist, but he also understood the broader global issues. So in that sense, he was very good. He was so approachable, so personal, that he dispensed with formalities on to a large degree. He said he hated to have to wear a uniform on formal occasions. It bored him, the formalities. I remember one time we stopped out the front of the Ministry of National Defense, and Admiral Sung was at that stage the defense minister. I remember Tony running up the steps of the ministry, taking several steps at a time, the guards panicking and trying to present arms to salute as he went by. He was too busy for that. We just went up the stairs, went straight into Admiral Sung's office, past the secretary, and Admiral Sung, the Minister of National Defense, immediately jumped to attention when his supposed junior officer came into the room. So much was the respect that Tony could generate just by the fact that he was a man of ideas who was there to help. And that was, I think, how he saw his role. His job was to help his country and to help the international debate on global strategic issues. So he was extremely enthusiastic, knowledgeable, and so on. But what he brought to the table was an incredible global experience of a type which very few Chinese, and I say mainland or Taiwanese, officers could equal. In this, he was rather unique. The level of his context, the level of his understanding, the level of his experience, and of course his very great humanity, sense of humor, sense of compassion, all were wonderful things. And as a result, he took me, a very young fellow at the time, and kept me under his wing, as it were, for more than 3 decades, where we would debate and discuss ideas. I know that I never felt that I would have to hesitate in presenting an idea to him. nor he to me. So I know that other officers in the Navy in the ROC must have felt equally comfortable about talking to him, exchanging ideas with him, asking him questions. So from that point of view, a great teacher and a man who was always learning from every source who came to him. So many things about Admiral Ko made a deep impression on me. The fact that he could talk on so many subjects with great depth of knowledge, the fact that he never flaunted his knowledge either. I mean, there was always a surprise when he talked about something, and you either then or later learned that this was as a result of having experienced some part of history or some knowledge or contact with which he had first-hand knowledge. One of the occasions I remember was when he was on my yacht in the south of France, and we picked him up in Cannes and then sailed overnight to the Gulf of Saint-Tropez. At dawn, as we entered the Gulf of Saint-Tropez, I said, "Well, Tony, not often you see a sight like this." And he said, "No, last time was 40 years ago when I was on board a British carrier and we were making the D-Day landings here in the Gulf of Saint-Tropez." And that was how I learned that he had actually participated in the D-Day landings in the south of France. I knew that he had already gone to a British naval school, the Royal Naval College at Greenwich, and had been seconded into the Royal Navy. But then I understood that he'd been at the D-Day landings in the south of France. When I asked him about that, he said, "Well, I just came down because I was also at the D-Day landings in Normandy." So he had first-hand knowledge of that. This was to prove critical to how the ROC saw the development of its own force structure some years later, after the Kuomintang government was moved from the mainland to Taiwan, when it had to think in terms of whether or how it could mount an amphibious invasion to retake the mainland back from the communists, or indeed how the ROC could defend against an amphibious attack from the People's Liberation Army and Navy, should they choose to attack Taiwan. He understood these situations about amphibious operations from first-hand experience, not just from study. He was one of the very few naval officers to have participated in both of those great aspects of the D-Day operations in Europe. He also, as I later came to discover when I saw him at the ROC Navy submarine headquarters, and he was greeted there with great honor, and I was told, well, Admiral Ko is the father of the ROC submarine service. And I started to learn about how he had undergone submarine training in Britain. So his experiences there were widespread. He also went, of course, to the US Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, which was, and still is, one of the premier institutions of military and naval thinking in the United States. And this is where he met Dr. Stefan Pisoni, the great grand strategist as well, and they formed a lifelong friendship as a result. But it was this level of ongoing experience. I mean, he went around the world. He understood the situations firsthand. He knew the Americans, he knew the British, he knew the other players in the game. He had, of course, fought, after he left the Royal Navy, he fought with the ROC Navy in operations against the Japanese, both before and after he was in the Royal Navy. And then, of course, had an intimate understanding of the ROC's naval operations against the communists in the immediate post-World War II days. But he understood and took a great interest throughout his career in all issues relating to maritime development and trade. When we organized a conference on the lessons of the South Atlantic War after the British-Argentinian conflict over the Falklands, Admiral Ko was with us in London as we did the debriefings and the analysis on that operation. And there were very few naval officers from Asia who took an interest in these things globally. So he understood how the world was thinking about maritime operations and about geopolitics. So basically we're seeing a situation where we had a man developing over more than 60 years of great geopolitical thinking. And just being involved and engaged at the highest levels for that length of time is gives a unique capability to a nation in itself. So as a result, it's hard to overstate how important his collective experience was to the ROC. It was immense. In a sense, he was China's Nelson and Mahan, the fighting admiral of Lord Nelson's capability, and the maritime strategic thinker of Admiral Mahan's capability, the American strategic writer who wrote about sea power. So he combined all of those things, and is one of the few, not only Chinese but Asian and Pacific figures to have that stature. So he was incredibly impressive with those kinds of things. Every time I met him, every time we were in some situation, he exhibited some other facet of his history and knowledge, which was profoundly impressive. Well, I think Admiral Ko affected me in many ways. Firstly, he taught me not to speak before I thought, because he was a man of incredible humility. He was not someone who stood on ceremony or on his position or on his experience, for that matter. He was always relaxed enough to be able to engage anybody in conversation and bring out the best in them. And that was something which I think was important to learn. I couldn't really begin to say how much I learned from him about maritime strategy or about China in specific terms, because it was a constant flow of ideas. He was also so open to ideas. If you threw an idea at him, he would come back with some counterpoint. We talked about how to, for example, improve the ROC's capabilities to secure itself as a maritime power. One of the things that he understood from the beginning was that once the ROC moved from the mainland to Taiwan as its main base of operations, that it had to think as a maritime power. And indeed, Taiwan, from its existence as the ROC, became a great trading nation, and as a result became a great maritime nation. Interestingly enough, that was not how most of the KMT leadership saw Taiwan at that time. The ROC was, and to a great extent today, is still dominated by army thinking. And yet this is a maritime state, just as Britain was, just as the great maritime powers were for the past 500 years. It was a state dependent upon sea trade and all the things that were necessary to create a prosperous maritime trading nation. So he saw why Taiwan needed a different set of diplomatic initiatives, why it needed to focus on straits and waterways, which were critical to the choke points, maritime choke points around the world. Why Taiwan had to take a very distinct interest in the security of those sea lines of communications and the choke points through which Taiwan's maritime trade would pass. Because he knew that this was where the ROC was vulnerable to pressures from hostile powers. He knew that it was critical to nurture relations throughout the world, in Africa and so on, where the resources were originating for Taiwanese factories. He understood the intimate connection which Taiwan had to have to survive with its sea lanes, with its sources of supply, and with its markets. And he had that intimate knowledge which made him a great thinker. Bear in mind that China historically has been a land power preoccupied by land movement of forces. From the earliest times, China has been focused on securing control of the Asian landmass, not the great waterways. And yet Tony Ko came into his own when the ROC came to Taiwan, because here was a great maritime thinker who could think beyond ground force action. He could think in the terms of a maritime trading nation. And to that extent, he gave Taiwan the underpinnings to become the great global economy that it is today. But basically, the first time I met Admiral Ko was with Dr. Pisoni, and then he started to come to a lot of the conferences which my organization organized around the world on strategic studies, not just maritime studies, but strategic studies generally. He arranged for me to come to Taipei on many occasions to meet with officials here, to talk to the Society for Strategic Studies, and with the government officials. So he and I just kept arranging events which would promote the agenda of strategic studies, both here in the ROC and around the world. And this also, I think, worked to his benefit as well, because our organization, which was based in the United States, was a platform at which he could meet many other officials, some of whom had known of him or knew him over the years, but we gave him a platform to speak and to meet. And in fact, so great was his contribution that in 2000, our organization, the International Strategic Studies Association, awarded him our greatest honor, which was the Medal for Outstanding Contributions to Strategic Service, which was something which we only give normally to heads of state or people of that sort of caliber who profoundly affect the global strategic situation. And the only other recipient that year was Caspar Weinberger, the U.S. Former Secretary of Defense. And so the two of those great leaders hit it off at the presentation ceremony and in Washington. But it's clear that Admiral Ko's contribution might even be more lasting and more significant even than Caspar Weinberger's was to the United States. One of the things about Admiral Ko was that he was always operating behind the scenes. He was never one for making open political statements. So as a result, he was not publicly visible in the United States during the evolution of the US ROC dialogue in the Cold War, nor when US President Jimmy Carter chose to essentially break the treaty obligations the US had with the ROC. However, during this period, he was extremely effective in sustaining links with senior US defense officials who understood the ROC position and who respected him enormously. So what we saw, even for years after the Carter presidency, was that there was a strong base of support in Washington and in the Pentagon for Taiwan and the ROC. This has now largely evaporated. The ROC has essentially little or no voice in the Pentagon or in the White House because there is nobody of the stature of Admiral Ko to talk in Washington and has the respect of the Washington or the U.S. defense establishment. So it would not be an understatement, or an overstatement rather, to say that Admiral Ko kept a real U.S. ROC strategic relationship going for many years after President Carter had thrown the ROC to the wolves. I think that, like almost any professional person in the strategic field who knew Admiral Ko, and many people in their personal lives, they all wanted more time with him. All I could think when he passed away was that I had so much more I wanted to ask him and talk with him about. Part of it was the fact that he was always reluctant to talk about his own history and his own incredibly adventurous life. And I think that this needs to be a point of study by some diligent researchers who need to start to get the specifics of his naval career and his governmental career down on paper, because there is so much there which he didn't talk about or write about, but which there are still people alive today who know some of the details. So getting all of those items down in paper would be incredibly helpful. A detailed biography of his life would be fascinating to read, and not only that, it would be important and instructive for Chinese people generally and Taiwanese people particularly to get a measure of what they could do with their lives and with their country. He was inspiring in that respect. He was immensely loyal to his friends. He was incredibly loyal to the Republic of China, regardless of the political persuasion of any government. He was loyal to the country and would always serve. So as a result, he never retired. He was never a man who was influenced by monetary gain, which was rare among people operating at that level of political leadership, and he was, to a great extent, a political leader as well as a military naval leader. But he wasn't interested in money. He was not interested in personal power. He was interested in ideas. He was interested in the welfare of his country. He believed in the great community of maritime nations around the world, which was why he understood the United States so well, why he understood the British so well. He was a man who had unique and deep connections with both the Americans and the British, who were the premier maritime powers of the 20th century. He understood, though, people from a wide range of countries, whether it's India or Australia, South America and the like. He actually understood their geography, their geopolitics, and their cultures. And I guess what I wanted, and what everybody else who knew him wanted, was more time with him, because it was not only a source of great intellectual inspiration, it was a source of great delight. He was a delightful man, generous, humorous, caring, and loyal. And he should be remembered for those human characteristics as well as for his great and towering strategic thinking. It was a source of great honor for me that literally one of the last major professional tasks that Admiral Ko undertook was to translate my book, The Art of Victory, into Chinese. So this book, this copy of which is now with the National Central Library, was a great achievement, which not only is now available in Chinese, but it's also something which Tony Ko refined so that it would be of value in helping to shape the ROC as a maritime power. So this, in a sense, was a successor to The Art of War, but it's The Art of Victory, and that's something which Tony Ko understood intimately. He understood that we had to have a goal for Taiwan, and that goal was victory. And so he grabbed my book, translated it into Chinese, and not only that, I'm sure improved it dramatically in making the point about what is necessary strategically for a nation to achieve victory. And right now, of course, he understood this implicitly. We talked about it in the week before he passed away, was the reality that the ROC needed to now refine its vision of the future, where it wanted to be as a nation state and how it intended to get there. And The Art of Victory was very much a part of that message to a new generation of Taiwanese political and military leaders. So for that, I'm always grateful to him. And this will be a great point of pride, not that I wrote the book, but that Admiral Ko was the one who translated it into Chinese. As I said, I was very much privileged to spend one of the last weeks of Admiral Ko's life with him and with his daughter Ming in Taipei at conferences at the Naval Command and Staff College, at the National Defense University, and then touring naval facilities in the ROC. And when I returned to Washington and his daughter Ming told me of his passing, I immediately started writing a eulogy to him about him, in which I said, Ko Tun Hwa, on his final patrol, commends the Chinas into the care of Matsu, one of the goddesses of the sea. And I used the reference to Matsu because he had been telling me of the maritime culture on both sides of the Straits of Taiwan, in which sailors looked to the goddess Matsu as someone who would help the sailors of all of China. And I think that was one of his ways of reminding me that the two Chinas still had a lot in common. But from his point of view, the ROC was the dominant part of the maritime equation of China, was the maritime China. So that was important. So I was very honored to be able to write a eulogy for Admiral Ko, which circulated to governments of about 160 countries around the world, so that people who knew him would have something to remember him by. At one of our conferences in Las Vegas, called Defense 83 in 1983, Admiral Ko was in one of the workshops dealing with the then recent PLA, or mainland Chinese, invasion of Vietnam. And there were a number of PLA officers in the audience, and they challenged his assertion that the PRC had invaded Vietnam. Admiral Ko was able to successfully convince the audience, and I think the PRC officers, that what they had undertaken was in fact an invasion of Vietnam, when the Chinese were trying at that stage to describe it merely as teaching the Vietnamese a lesson. And I think that actually helped transform the debate on that affair into one which was seen widely subsequently as a PRC invasion of Vietnam, and it basically helped shape Asian opinion particularly as to the PRC's intentions in the region. So that was quite a significant thing, but it showed me that he had all the facts at his command, as usual. He had the courage to call things by what they were. He didn't become diplomatic and evasive. He tackled the problem head on. He didn't mind a strong debate with people to get his point across. And it was courageous. It was handled beautifully. It was handled with a sense of humor as well. But that was an interesting engagement between then PRC military officers and Admiral Ko on a U.S. forum. It was very instructive, and a lot of people still comment on it to this day.